We're going to start by taking a 20-minute walk across the University of Waterloo campus from the archives to a Mennonite museum on campus called Brubaker House. And this is the Brubaker House kitchen, circa about 1850. If you're like me and if you can just close your eyes and imagine for a minute what it must have been like in 1850 with 2 parents, 14, that's right, 14 children. And so you can imagine the sights and the sounds and the smells, perhaps the mud on the floor, and the chaos that would be this kitchen as the family engages in preparing food. So food is a huge part of our lives. And so how do we, as archives who are supposed to represent lives lived, how do we represent the life of the place of food in our lives? And one way is through recipe books. And in our library, we have approximately 300 recipe books. And those range from everything from high gloss, fancy books published professionally to little spiral bound volumes that might be done by a congregation. But we try to collect Mennonite recipe books when we can. Now in the archives is where we keep our handwritten and more fragile recipe books, such as these. On the left, you see Susanna Betzner-Kressman's book, and she was a Swiss Mennonite who lived in Waterloo County in the early part of the 20th century. And as you can see by the dog ears and the stains, this was a well-used book. One of the things I find most interesting about her book is it's not just what we would think of as common Swiss Mennonite recipes, but she also has things in there like curries. And so I imagine her perhaps trading recipes with her English neighbors. And on the other side there, you see a recipe book by Margareta Kreger-Regier. And you might not be able to see this, but she has her name written out 3 or 4 different times. She started out in Ukraine in Rosenthal, and then later on, she indicates Saskatchewan, 1938. So you can see her progression from a young woman in Russia who wrote her recipes in Russian and German. And then later on in the book, we see that she has written recipes in English and partial English, partial German, and that she has made that transition to Canada. So this is a recipe book that has an immigrant story attached to it, which makes it fascinating in its own way. And this little book takes us well into the 20th century, in probably the 1930s. This is a book that was assembled by Anne Eby when she was a student in Kitchener. And you can see on the one side of the page, the printed side, it says Household Science, 2nd year, and a bunch of different recipes put out by Kitchener Public Schools for puddings in this case. But there are lots of other pages with different recipes. And there is a whole page detailing how to wash dishes. So if you want to know how to wash dishes, this lays it out for you. It's all about the science of keeping the home. And on the other side of the page there, we see a handwritten recipe that Anne has written in, I'm supposing that this was a friend of hers, Jean Zare. Jean Zare's recipe for raspberry swirl. And it contains Jell-O, which was all the rage in the 1930s. And so maybe along the way, as a Mennonite, you have heard lots of jokes about Mennonite potlucks and Jell-O salads. And the Jell-O salads seem to contain everything from carrots to marshmallows to orange segments. And there's kind of a joke about the Jell-O salad. Well, a lot of the cooks that started that tradition did so in the 1930s. That's how they learned to make Jell-O salads, and that's where it started to become quite popular in Mennonite potluck cooking. So let's move now one more generation forward. And we're now going into the 1960s. And I'll introduce you to Edna Stabler, for those of you who don't know her. That's Edna there, pictured in her home, in her cottage, she called it, on Sunfish Lake, which is just outside of Kitchener-Waterloo area. And pictured with her is the cover of her first cookbook, Food That Really Schmecks. And if you don't know what schmecks means, ask someone or use your imagination. So Edna was born in Kitchener in 1906, and although her parents were of Mennonite ancestry, they were not practicing Mennonites. She did not grow up a practicing Mennonite. Before she turned to cookbook writing, she developed a career as a writer, especially writing a lot of travelogues and stories about the different regions of Canada and the people that she met there. I've skimmed through a number of her stories, and her writing is quite delightful and quite vivid. She wrote a lot about Waterloo County Mennonites, and she was often called upon to interpret Old Order Mennonite and Amish life for a national audience that was becoming increasingly curious about who the Mennonites were. And in 1968, as you can see, she published her first cookbook, Food That Really Schmecks. And I'll just read directly from her introduction here. She talks about how this book came to be. It's an interesting story. I was in a panic the first time I invited some rather special people from Toronto to have dinner at our cottage on Sunfish Lake. They were prominent writers and editors with their wives who frequently traveled all over the world, ate in sophisticated dining rooms, talked and wrote columns about fabulous foods, and were proud of their gourmet cookery. What could I serve them that they would find tasty and interesting? I went through all the recipes I had collected. I spent hours reading French and American cookbooks borrowed from the Kitchener Public Library. What in God's green bounteous earth could I feed them? Why don't you give them bean salad with a sour cream dressing, suggested a friend. It's tremendous, and I bet they've never tasted it. And how about a schnitz pie for dessert? Bean salad? Schnitz pie? Ordinary everyday food for company? Unthinkable. I pondered, but why not? Why not a typical North Waterloo County meal, my own way of cooking, my mother's, my neighbor's, my Mennonite friend Betty Martin? My distinguished guests couldn't get that in a flossy restaurant anywhere, or even find the recipes in their Epicurean cookbooks. My dinner would not be elaborate or exotic, with rare ingredients and mystifying flavors. Traditional local cooking is practical, designed to fill up small boys and big men. My guests from Toronto arrived. I served them bean salad, smoked pork chops, and shoe-fly pie. At first they said, just a little bit, please, but as soon as they tasted, their praise was extravagant. They ate till everything was gone. For the past 15 years, they have been coming back to my cottage for a weekend in August, and each time I invite them, they say they hope I'll give them another old-fashioned Mennonite meal. Why don't you write a cookbook? They ask me whenever they come, and I said, oh, I couldn't. I'm just a sporadic amateur in the kitchen, not a trained home economist. But eventually, Edna's friends persuaded her, and she did write the book. And now you have the foundation for what is to become the Cookie War. I should add, before we go any further, that Schmeck's became a tremendous hit, selling thousands and thousands of copies in Canada. And it's interesting, we're kind of used to this now, but at the time it was kind of different because it was interspersed with stories and commentary. It was as much about the book about the people as about the food, and that was a little bit different at the time. You can see this interesting attitude in the back here of the book. And on the back cover, it says, throughout Waterloo County, recipes were generously swapped and invented till a way of cooking developed that is unique and indigenous to this heaven-blessed area that rejoices in its cultivation, preparation, and tranquil digestion of irresistibly good schmecking food. So I just think it's really interesting that it took the praise of the cosmopolitan Toronto people to bring this book into being. And Edna, the way she paints herself as kind of being unable to conceive of the idea that her sophisticated friends could enjoy this simple country food. And just contrasting that with today, when we really long for the local and the authentic and the regional when it comes to food. And there's this whole industry based around giving people that authentic local food experience. But of course, at all this time that this was happening, this desire to celebrate the local, food was becoming more industrial. And in the 1980s, the cookie industry became preoccupied with making their cookies, their industrially produced cookies, taste more authentically homemade. Procter & Gamble in the United States spent 6 years developing and testing a cookie that was soft on the inside and crispy on the outside, like a homemade cookie, but on an industrial scale, a homemade cookie that could sit on the shelf for months and still taste good. The cookie market was incredibly competitive. And the soft cookie, the homemade light cookie, was seen as a way of kind of gaining a market edge. And they also discovered in some of their research that adults like to buy more kind of expensive soft cookies and hide them away. They gave the children the hard cookies, and they ate the nice and soft ones when their kids were in bed. So there was a sense here too that if we had kind of an upmarket soft cookie, that would be something that people would buy. But by the mid-1980s, the soft cookie market was crumbling. A lot of these firms had over-advertised and oversold the idea of being just like homemade, and people just didn't buy it. So the big players started to look around at their competition. And in March 1984, Procter & Gamble sued Nabisco for patent infringement of a soft and chewy cookie process. The law firms for Nabisco hired readers to go through stacks of recipe books, looking for examples of soft and chewy two-dough cookies that were in the public domain in order to dispute the patent. And there, in Food That Really Schmecks, on page 193, they found something they thought could work for them. A recipe for Riggelbeke Kuka, railway cookies. I apologize if I got that wrong to the Pennsylvania German speakers out there. A light sugar cookie dough and a dark molasses sweetened dough that were swirled together to make a crisp and chewy cookie. So, and that's how lawyers from both sides of this dispute began making their trek to Edna Stabler's Waterloo County home in search of cookies. And at the same time, lawyers were casting their net far and wide to Mennonite archives and libraries and historical societies across North America, trying to find these authentic Mennonite cookies. And if there are archivists and librarians out there in Mennonite institutions, you could probably look back in your collections about 1984, and there's probably something in your correspondence related to this case. So what you see on the screen here is an advertisement that appeared in an Amish magazine called Family Life. And Family Life is published by David Luthi of Pathway Publishers in Aylmer, Ontario. And he was contacted by a law firm in Ottawa who was involved in the case. And he writes, "How well I remember when two Ottawa lawyers drove up our farm lane and parked a rented gold Lincoln in front of the library building. I kept imagining what my Amish neighbors were thinking. So I suggest they come next time in a less noticeable car." So these lawyers had asked for this ad to be printed, and so Pathway printed it up and offered $15 for the first 10 people who sent us a two-dough, two-sugar cookie recipe, and asked the letter writers to say where they got the recipe from, was it an old family recipe, and so on. So we have a folder of these letters from Amish and Mennonite women kind of across North America, just writing in. They identified the cookies by different names, not only railway cookies, but pinwheel cookies, and other names as well. Ribbon cookies was another one. And again, if you are in a Mennonite Archives and Library, you could probably look back in your newspaper collections about 1984 and see these ads in a number of publications. So Edna Stabler, there she is again, this time she's holding up two of those railway cookies. Edna Stabler at first thought this whole thing was great fun. She received many visits from lawyers. They literally wined and dined her at local restaurants. They persuaded her to help them find old order Mennonite women who would bake batches of these cookies for them. And they paid them $20 an hour, which was quite a healthy wage at that point. In an article for Saturday Night Magazine, she describes the encounters between big city Toronto and New York lawyers and old order Mennonites, with Edna acting as the cultural interpreter between them. A number of these lawyers were pretty impressed with the Mennonite way of life. One said, "They're like no one I've ever met before. Being with them makes me feel happy." Others found Mennonites difficult to deal with. According to Edna, who said, "The Mennonites eschew modern luxuries, such as the telephone, refuse to swear affidavits, and consider the suit a lot of foolishness," which of course frustrated the lawyers to no end. As the suit dragged on for a number of years, Edna became increasingly worried about subpoenas, and she asked the Nabisco lawyers specifically about whether she and the Mennonite women cookie bakers could be compelled to testify in court. But one of the Nabisco lawyers assured her, nothing could be worse for the image of Nabisco than subjecting Mennonite ladies in white bonnets to a session in court. Eventually, the cookie war ended in an out-of-court settlement in 1989. But the cookie war lived on for a few years in other forms. A play called The Cookie War was first produced in 1988, and several productions were mounted in Southern Ontario. So the story takes place in a fictional town called Rhineland, Ontario. And of course, it's a play, so it's going to take some liberties with the story. In the play, we meet Mrs. Reimer, a Russian Mennonite gift shop owner who sells the cookies made by her old order Mennonite friend. Enter a street smart, young, tough female New York City lawyer who shows up to get a batch of cookies and persuade the women to testify in court. The lawyer is alternately frustrated and charmed by the Mennonite way of life. There are some cultural misunderstandings. For example, when she tries to explain feminism to a 16-year-old old order Mennonite girl. There are also times when the homespun wisdom of the old order Mennonites charms her over and makes her see life a little differently. And all the while all this is going on, more lawyers show up, there's some confrontations, and Mrs. Reimer's son pops in and out to make sly criticisms about capitalism and corporate greed. And this is 1984. So of course, that makes perfect sense that you have that kind of critique happening. And of course, it's a play, so there has to be some romance. So there is a romance that develops in the midst of all of this. So you can see there were several productions of this play, including one by UMEI, United Mennonite Educational Institute in Leamington. So the legend of the Cookie War grew and hit the press nationally in Canada. This particular illustration has nothing to do with the Cookie War movie. It's just a little illustration that I found in Ontario Lawyers Weekly. And I thought it was just kind of an interesting commentary on how one way that you can see this Cookie War playing out. In 1988, two writers completed a screenplay, and we have a copy of that screenplay in the archives. The rights were sold, but a movie was never produced. I speculate that perhaps some of you will remember the movie Witness that came out in 1985 and how popular that was. And I wonder if there was some sense of, well, maybe there's a market here for more Amish and Mennonite related feature movies. But this particular one didn't go anywhere. However, I did skim through the script, and it struck me as not being, there are some differences from the play, but it struck me as not being that different from many of the kind of Hallmark Christmas movies that we see out these days, where there's some kind of romance that takes place, and sometimes there's a big city person who comes to the country and sees life differently. And there's lots of these themes in the Cookie War movie script. So who knows, maybe it will find its way into an actual production someday. So in 1987, David Luthi wrote to Edna Stabler, and he said, "Would you believe that we still have the cookies that those old order women made for the lawyers?" He says to Edna, "Shall we have them sometime with tea?" And then he says, "No, I think I will keep them for historical interest." And so David Luthi kept those cookies for decades. And in 2019, I drove down to the Heritage Historical Library in Aylmer, and he presented me with some old order things, including all of the images of the papers that you saw today. Those are all part of his collection that has come to our archives. And then he pulled out this degrading old Tupperware from a cupboard, and inside were 3 cookies wrapped in cellophane that he had kept all those years. And the women who made them, their names were even kept with the cookies. So rarely do we have the chance to admire the baking skills of a 40-year-old cookie. And I admire them in particular because I did try to make a batch myself a couple years ago. And although they tasted good enough, they didn't have the same molded precision as these examples. You can really appreciate the skill of the baking involved. And they're also a lot of work. They're a lot of work. And even Edna Stabler writes that even old order Mennonite women tended not to bake them on a regular basis. They might be a special cookie at Christmas, but even for them, it seemed like a lot of work. So I'm not sure I want to leave you with the impression that the archives will always preserve baking. So maybe don't come to me with your 40-year-old zwieback or your pickled beets or your kimchi and expect that we'll preserve them. However, maybe if they come with a really good story, we can find a place for your food on our shelves. I hope you enjoyed this little story. Thanks for listening.